You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you.
I have no enemies.
There's a Victorian poem by Charles Mackay called No Enemy, built around a rather unsettling idea that to claim you have no enemies may not be something to be proud of at all. Perhaps it means you have never stood for anything, never challenged anyone, never spoken when silence was easier, never placed yourself between what is right and what is wrong. To have no enemies, in Mackay's eyes, can almost sound like an accusation, but Makoto Yukimura challenges this idea throughout Vinland Saga. Because what if having no enemies isn't the result of never opposing anything? What if it is the result of refusing to hate the person you oppose? What if you can stand against something without creating an enemy? And that brings us to a strange contradiction. Contradiction contained in 4 words.
I have no enemies.
There's something almost impossible about these words. Not because enemies don't exist, they do. People betray us, hurt us, take from us, people kill, and sometimes they do it deliberately. So what could it possibly mean to say, I have no enemies? Is it weakness? Forgiveness? Pacifism? Is it simply refusing to hate? Or is it something more difficult? Because perhaps having no enemies doesn't mean living in a world where nobody opposes you. Perhaps it means something much harder, refusing to become an enemy yourself. And this is where the story of Thorfinn begins to matter, because long before he became the man who said, I have no enemies, he was a boy who had built his entire existence around one. Askeladd, his father's killer, his enemy, and his purpose. For years, Thorfinn believed that if he could only kill the man responsible, the hatred would finally end. But hatred has a strange way of keeping the person you hate alive, even after they are gone. Because sometimes the enemy doesn't disappear when you defeat them. Sometimes they become a part of you. This is not a story about how to avoid conflict. It's not an argument that evil doesn't exist. It is not the claim that Thorfinn is right about everything. It's a question that is far older than Vinland Saga, and perhaps far more difficult to answer. What would it actually mean to live as if you have no enemies? And if such life is possible, what would it require us to become? Let's rewind a little bit. Think about the word enemy. An enemy isn't simply someone who harms you. If someone attacks you, that's an event. If someone repeatedly tries to harm you, they're an opponent or a threat. But enemy carries something more psychological. You've placed this person into a category of the people against me. But see, I caught myself in a paradoxical scenario. If having no enemies doesn't mean nobody opposes you, but an enemy is one who is against you, isn't that contradictory? Yes, it is. However, when Thorfinn says he has no enemies, he's broadening the term enemy not simply mean someone who opposes me, but to mean someone I oppose who opposes me, and that would not be contradictory. So then, having no enemies doesn't mean living in a world without opposition. It means refusing to reciprocate opposition. Maybe an enemy is a relationship of opposition, one in which hatred is returned with hatred, violence with violence, revenge with revenge. And if that's true, then having no enemies doesn't mean living in a world without conflict. It means refusing to make conflict reciprocal. But there's an obvious problem. That sounds beautiful when spoken as an idea. It's much harder when someone actually hurts you, because hatred isn't born in philosophy. It's born in loss, humiliation, grief, fear. It's built in the feeling that someone has taken something from you, something that can never be returned. So the question isn't merely, can you imagine having no enemies? The question is, can you become the kind of person who actually lives that? And there is no better person through whom to ask that question than Thorfinn. What happens when the person who gives your life purpose is the person you want dead? As I mentioned before Thorfinn said, I have no enemies, he lived for one. Askeladd, the man who killed his father. For a child, losing a father is already an incomprehensible wound. But Thorfinn finds something to attach that pain to. A person, a name, a face. Askeladd. And from that moment forward, his life begins to narrow. He doesn't simply want Askeladd dead. He wants to be the one who kills him. He follows him, fights for him, kills for the opportunity to one day stand across from him and take his life. And then something subtle happens. Something more dangerous than hatred itself. Hatred becomes purpose. Thorfinn's life begins to organize itself around a single proposition. Askeladd must die at my hand. Everything else becomes secondary. Every battle, every wound, every year, every sacrifice, they all point toward the same destination. And that creates a strange relationship between victim and enemy, because Thorfinn believes he is pursuing Askeladd, but Askeladd is also giving Thorfinn's life direction. As long as Askeladd is alive, Thorfinn has something to pursue, something to become, to wake up for. And in a strange way, Thorfinn needs his enemy, not because he loves him, but because his hatred has become an identity. And this is what makes his story more than a story about revenge, because revenge doesn't merely ask, who hurt me? It eventually asks, who am I without the person I hate? Thorfinn doesn't realize this yet. He thinks Askeladd will free him, that one final act will close the wound, that once the person responsible is gone, the hatred will disappear with him. The hatred has a strange quality. It can make the person you hate the center of your entire existence. And when that happens, destroying your enemy means destroying the thing around which your identity was built. Because before Thorfinn can learn to live without enemies, he has to discover what it means to live for one. And that is where his real journey begins. For years, Thorfinn believes that his suffering has a simple solution. Askeladd must die. And perhaps that's what makes revenge so seductive. It gives suffering a direction. Pain becomes anger, anger becomes hatred, and hatred becomes purpose. And suddenly, the chaos of grief has been reduced to a single, simple objective. Make the person responsible suffer. Thorfinn doesn't have to wonder what his life is for. He knows. He doesn't have to wonder where he's going. Askeladd is waiting at the end of the road. And so Thorfinn walks toward him again and again and again. I'm gonna kill you for that! Tell me the last thing you see! But this raises a question. What if revenge isn't really about the person we hate? What if it's about what hatred gives us? Because if someone takes something from you that can never be returned, what are you supposed to do with that pain? You can't undo what happened. You can't bring the dead back. You can't return to the person you were before it happened. But revenge offers something that almost feels like an answer. Balance. If they made me suffer, then they should suffer too. And maybe, for a moment, it makes the world feel right again. But is it justice? Or is it simply another form of suffering? To understand why Thorfinn spends so much of his life chasing an enemy, we first have to understand something about ourselves. Why do we want revenge at all? For Thorfinn, it all starts with loss. The loss of his family, the loss of identity, and the loss of hope. Askeladd takes all of this away when he kills his father, Thor. He throws away all of his hope. A boy who once dreamed of exploring distant lands and becoming a great warrior like his father, now joining the one who killed him for revenge. With this, he also lost his vision because he forgot the warmth of Vinland and traded it for the burning sensation of Valhalla. During his years with Askeladd, his dream of Vinland was entirely dead. He was not fighting for a bright future or a legendary land. He was living entirely in the past, trapped by a ghost. But to him, at this moment, none of that matters, because his father is dead, and there is nothing he can do to change it. The past doesn't negotiate, and it doesn't apologize, and it doesn't give anything back. And perhaps that is one of the hardest things about being hurt. Sometimes what was taken from us cannot be restored. Thorfinn cannot bring Thor's back. He can't simply return to the day before his death. He cannot undo what happened. But there is one thing he can still do. He can find the person responsible, and suddenly his grief has somewhere to go. Askeladd, the man who killed his father, the man responsible for the wound. And so Thorfinn begins to believe that if he can only kill Askeladd, somehow something will be made right. This is where revenge begins. Not necessarily with cruelty, not necessarily with hatred, but with a very human intuition. If you cause me suffering, something should happen to you because of it. Perhaps that intuition isn't entirely wrong, because when we see an injustice, we don't simply think, that was unfortunate. We think, that was wrong. And when something is wrong, we want it corrected. We want the person responsible to be held accountable. We want the world to acknowledge that what happened should not have happened. This is the beginning of justice. But somewhere between this was wrong and you must suffer for what you did, something changes. Because justice asks, what should be done about the wrong? But revenge asks, what should be done to the person who wronged me? And those questions sound almost identical, but they aren't. Thorfinn isn't simply looking for justice, he wants Askeladd to die. And not only that, he wants to be the one who kills him. Because if Askeladd suffers, perhaps Thorfinn's suffering will finally mean something. Perhaps the scales will finally balance. But will they? If Askeladd dies, does Thor's return? Does Thorfinn get his childhood back? Do the years of hatred disappear? Can the dead be restored by making another person suffer? Perhaps this is the first problem we encounter when we try to live without enemies. Because before we can stop hating on our enemies, we have to understand why we believe they deserve our hatred in the first place. There is a reason revenge has survived for as long as humanity has. Because at first, it doesn't look like revenge. It looks like justice. Someone takes something from you, someone hurts someone you love, someone commits an act that should never have happened. And something inside of us says, this cannot simply be allowed to pass. There must be a consequence, an answer. There must be a moment when the world recognizes what happened was wrong. And perhaps that instinct is not something we should simply suppress. Because imagine a world in which every wrong was met with indifference, where a person could murder and nothing happened, where a person could steal and nothing happened, where a person could destroy another life and everyone simply looked away. We would not call that peace. We would call that injustice. So the desire for justice serves us a purpose. It tells us that something should not happen. But then comes to the dangerous question. Who gets to decide what the answer should be? Because when the person who was hurt becomes the person who delivers the punishment, the line begins to blur. Justice says a wrong has been committed. Revenge says, and I will make you pay for it. Justice asks, what is right? And revenge asks, what do you deserve? And perhaps most importantly, justice can't exist without hatred. Revenge almost always carries it. Because revenge doesn't merely want the wrong to be recognized. It wants the person responsible to feel something. Pain, loss, fear, the same wound, or something worse. And this is where Thorfinn's story becomes so tragic, because he isn't simply asking for Askeladd to be punished. He wants to be the one who does it. He wants Askeladd to look him in the eye. He wants to know that the man who took his father from him has finally suffered at his hands. Again, again, again. And every time Thorfinn loses, the answer seems to be the same. Become stronger. Because perhaps the next time he will finally be powerful enough. But notice what has happened. Thorfinn began with a question. How can I make right what was done to my father? And somewhere along the way, the question became, how can I kill the man who did it? The first question is about justice. The second is about revenge. And the difference between them is not merely what happens to Askeladd, it's what happens to Thorfinn. Because justice is supposed to restore order after violence, but revenge can create a new reason for violence. One act creates another. The second demands a third. And the third creates a fourth. Until nobody remembers where the cycle began. Only that someone has to pay. And perhaps that is the oldest lie revenge tells us. Once they suffer, you will finally be free. Because if that were true, then Thorfinn should have been the happiest person in the world. All he needs is one moment, death, one final act, and then everything will be over. But what happens when the person you've spent your entire life trying to kill is suddenly gone? For years, Thorfinn believed there was an ending, not a metaphorical one, a real ending. A moment waiting somewhere in the future when everything would finally make sense. Askeladd would die, and Thorfinn would be free. It was almost a promise, because revenge has to promise something. Otherwise, why would we chase it? It tells us, just a little longer, just become a little stronger, get closer, just make them pay, and eventually the pain will have somewhere to go. But there's something revenge can never promise. It cannot give you back what you've lost. It can only give you another event, another wound, another death, another memory. And Thorfinn doesn't understand that. He's still a boy standing at the beginning of a road he thinks has a destination. Then everything changes. Askeladd dies, but not by Thorfinn's hand. And for a moment, the world should have become simple. The enemy is finally gone. The man responsible is dead. The story should be over. But Thorfinn doesn't feel free. He doesn't feel victorious. He doesn't feel whole. Because the future he spent his entire life moving toward has disappeared. There is no final duel, no satisfaction, no moment in which years of suffering suddenly becomes worth it. There's only nothing. And this is perhaps the cruelest thing revenge can do. It can convince you that your enemy is the destination, when your enemy was actually the road. For years, Thorfinn knew exactly who he was. He was the son of Thor. He was the one who would kill Askeladd. He was the one who would avenge his father. But now, who is he? When the enemy disappears, what remains of the person who needed them? This is where Thorfinn's story stops becoming a story about revenge and becomes a story about identity. Because the problem was never simply that Thorfinn hated Askeladd. The problem was that he had built a life around hatred. His suffering had become his purpose. His enemy had become his direction. And now that direction is gone. The boy who wanted revenge has finally lost the one thing he thought would make him whole. And perhaps this is the real lesson of this journey. Destroying your enemy does not necessarily destroy the hatred. Sometimes it leaves you alone with it. And for the first time in his life, Thorfinn has nowhere left to run, no enemy to chase, no revenge to pursue, no future to conquer, only himself. And perhaps that is where the real battle begins. For the first time in his life, Thorfinn has nothing to chase. No enemy, no revenge, no battlefield. No destination, only silence. And at first, that sounds like peace. But peace is not the same thing as silence, because when the world finally becomes quiet, you can hear the things you've been running from. His hands move, his body works, day after day, but his mind does not rest. Thorfinn sleeps, and the dead return. Faces he remembers, faces he doesn't. Bodies falling, blood, scream. The violence he once treated as a means to an end now has nowhere left to hide, because there's no longer anybody to blame, no enemy to blame. Askeladd is dead. The war is somewhere behind him. The revenge is over. But the people Thorfinn killed are still dead. And this is where the story becomes something different. Because guilt is strange. It doesn't ask, who is your enemy? It asks, who have you become? For years, Thorfinn had defined himself through what he would do to another person. Now he's forced to look at what he has done. And perhaps this is more frightening than any enemy he has ever faced. Because you can run from another person, you can sail to another country, you can cross an ocean, and you can put down your sword, but you can't simply leave yourself behind. The hands that once held a weapon are now holding a hoe, but changing what your hands hold doesn't immediately change what they have done. And so Thorfinn begins to confront something he never had to confront, while revenge gave him purpose, responsibility. Not what did Askeladd do to me, but what have I done to others? Not who deserves to suffer, but what am I going to do with the suffering I've caused? And that distinction changes everything, because revenge had always pointed outward, toward Askeladd, toward the enemy, toward something else. Now Thorfinn's gaze turns inward, and what he finds in there is not a hero, it's not a victim. It's a boy who has spent years becoming something he never wanted to be, a killer. This is where Thorfinn begins to understand the true cost of violence. Not simply that violence hurts the person on the receiving end, but that violence changes the person who commits it. Every act becomes part of you. Every person you reduce to an enemy becomes easier to kill, until eventually you no longer have to convince yourself that they are human. You only have to convince yourself that they are against you. And that's how the cycle survives. One person suffers, they create an enemy, the enemy suffers, and they create another enemy. And each person can tell themselves the same story, only doing this because of what they did first. Until the beginning is impossible to find. A man kills a man, his son seeks revenge, his son becomes a killer, someone else loses a father, and the cycle begins again. Someone has to stop it, and for Thorfinn, that realization begins with something incredibly simple. He can't change the past, resurrect the dead, or undo every life he took, but he can decide what happens next. And maybe this is the first real step toward having no enemies. Not pretending that nobody has been hurt, not pretending that evil doesn't exist, not pretending that the past doesn't matter, but refusing to let the violence of the past dictate the violence of the future. Thorfinn spent his childhood asking, who do I need to kill? And now, for the first time, he begins asking a different question. What kind of person do I want to become? Hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by non-hatred. The words are ancient. Long before Thorfinn ever set foot on a battlefield, people were asking the same question. What happens when suffering creates hatred? And what happens when hatred creates more suffering? Because perhaps the problem with revenge is not simply that it hurts another person. Maybe the deeper problem is that it reproduces the thing that created it. One person suffers, so they make another person suffer. That person suffers, so they seek someone else to blame. And the circle continues. A father dies, a son seeks revenge, a village is burned, a child grows up hating the people who burned it. That child grows up, burns another village. The names change, the faces change, but the structure remains. Suffering to hatred, hatred to violence, violence to more suffering, and then again. Maybe this is what Thorfinn finally begins to understand. His father's death was not the beginning of violence, and Askeladd was not its end. Thorfinn was simply another person caught inside something much larger than himself. A cycle that existed before him and could continue after him, unless someone chooses not to continue it. This idea appears throughout Buddhist thought. Suffering gives rise to craving. Craving gives rise to attachment, and hatred becomes another form of attachment. Because the person you hate remains psychologically tied to you. You can leave them behind physically and still carry them everywhere. Thorfinn spent years trying to destroy Askeladd. But even when Askeladd dies, Thorfinn is still carrying him. Not because Askeladd is alive, but because what happened between them is still alive in Thorfinn. And maybe that's what makes hatred so strange. You can hate someone for years without them ever thinking about you. You can let someone who hurt you occupy your mind while they are nowhere near you. You can allow a person who harmed you once to continue harming you for years without them ever touching you again. The enemy is gone, but the relationship remains. And maybe this is why letting go is so difficult, because letting go can feel like surrender. It can feel like saying, what happened didn't matter. But that isn't necessarily what letting go means. You can remember what happened without becoming defined by it. You can acknowledge that something was wrong without needing to reproduce that wrong. You can refuse to forgive immediately without choosing hatred as your identity. And maybe most importantly, you can stop the cycle without pretending the cycle never existed. But this creates another problem, because if hatred creates more hatred, what happens when someone genuinely does evil? What happens when someone is trying to hurt you? When refusing violence means allowing someone else to suffer? Is breaking the cycle always the right thing to do? Or can refusing to fight sometimes become another form of surrender? Thorfinn has learned how destructive hatred can be, but he has not yet answered the harder question. How do you resist evil without becoming consumed by hatred for the person committing it? And maybe that question leads us to another tradition, one that asks us to look not at the enemy, but at ourselves. Stoicism. The question remains, if another person hurts you, what belongs to you? And what belongs to them? You cannot control another person's anger. You cannot control another person's violence. You can't control what somebody says about you. You can't control what they did yesterday or what they'll do tomorrow. And yet, we often live as though we can. We spend years trying to change the people who hurt us, trying to make them understand, make them regret it, trying to make them suffer enough so that somehow our suffering will feel justified. But the Stoics began from a different place. Epictetus wrote, "Some things are up to us, and some things are not." It sounds almost painfully simple, but beneath it is a difficult idea. There are things that belong to us, judgments, choices, actions, and there are things that do not. Other people's actions, their opinions, their decisions, the past, the outcome. And once you understand that distinction, the idea of an enemy begins to change. Because what does an enemy actually have power over? They can hurt your body, take your possessions, insult you, betray you, but there is still one thing they cannot control for you: what you choose to become in response. Thorfinn spent years allowing Askeladd to determine the direction of his life. Askeladd made a choice, and Thorfinn built his future around it. Askeladd killed Thors. Thorfinn chose revenge. Askeladd walked away, but Thorfinn followed. Askeladd fought. Thorfinn became a warrior. And in a sense, Askeladd's actions were controlling Thorfinn long after they had happened. And maybe that's one of the strangest forms of captivity. Not being physically chained to someone, but allowing something they did to determine who you become. You can be physically free and psychologically bound. And this is where Stoicism offers something to Thorfinn's philosophy. Perhaps freedom isn't the ability to control everything that happens to you. Maybe freedom is knowing what is actually yours to control. You can't change what Askeladd did, but you can decide what to do with it. You can't undo your father's death, but you can decide what kind of life you build after. You can't erase the people you killed, but you can decide what kind of person you become now. And suddenly, the question changes. It's no longer, how do I make this person who hurt me pay? It becomes, what am I going to do with what happened to me? That's a very different question, because revenge looks backward. It asks, who caused this? But responsibility looks forward. It asks, what happens next? And maybe that's why Thorfinn's transformation is not simply about becoming peaceful. He doesn't erase his past. He doesn't pretend violence never happened. He doesn't become someone who has never suffered. He becomes someone who refuses to let his suffering dictate the rest of his life. But there's a limit to this idea, because it would be easy to misunderstand Stoicism as nothing matters because you can't control it. But that's not the point. If someone is hurting an innocent person, you may not control their actions, but you can still choose to intervene. If someone commits an injustice, you may not control the outcome, but you can still act. The distinction is not between action and inaction, it's between what you control and what you don't. And that distinction matters, because perhaps having no enemies doesn't require becoming passive. Maybe it requires becoming free. Free enough to act without hatred, free enough to resist without revenge, free enough to stand against someone without allowing them to determine the person standing against them. Even that leaves something unanswered. Stoicism can tell us, master yourself. Buddhism can tell us, let go of hatred. But there is a question neither answer fully resolves. What if the person standing against you is genuinely your enemy? What if they persecute you, hate you, or hurt you, and you have every reason to hate them back? What then would it mean not merely to control your hatred, but to replace it with something else? And centuries before Thorfinn ever spoke those words, another teacher gave an answer. Not ignore your enemies, not pretend they aren't enemies, but something far more radical. Love your enemies.
You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you.
Not tolerate them, not ignore them, not pretend they didn't hurt you. Love them. And suddenly, the philosophy becomes much more difficult. Because it's one thing to say, I won't take revenge. It's another thing to say, I want good for the person who hurt me. And Jesus doesn't give this command in a vacuum. It comes in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, where he repeatedly takes familiar commandments and pushes them even deeper. You've heard, you shall not murder. But Jesus goes beyond the physical act. Anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to a judgment. You've heard, you shall not commit adultery. But Jesus goes deeper again when he speaks about what happens inside the heart. And then comes retaliation. You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. The principle was originally about limiting retaliation. An eye for an eye, not two eyes. Not a life for an insult. The punishment should correspond to the harm. But Jesus goes even further. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. And then he gives examples. If someone strikes you, turn the other cheek. If someone takes your clothing, give more. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go 2. And then comes the culmination. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. This isn't simply a command to feel affection toward people who hurt you. It's a command about how you respond to them. Because Jesus is confronting the logic of retaliation itself. The logic that says, you hurt me, therefore I hurt you. Eye for eye, pain for pain, hatred for hatred. Jesus interrupts that sequence, not by pretending the original wrong didn't happen, but by refusing to let the wrong determine what happens next. And suddenly, Thorfinn's journey begins to look strangely familiar. Someone takes his father, he seeks revenge, someone creates suffering, and he creates more suffering. The violence continues, because each person believes their violence is justified by what came before it. Jesus presents another possibility. What if the chain ends with you? What if someone hates you and you refuse to hate them back? What if someone harms you and you refuse to make their suffering the condition for your peace? What if you can acknowledge what you did was wrong without adding, therefore, I must hurt you? That distinction is enormous, because forgiveness is not the same thing as saying nothing happened. Love does not require pretending evil is good. It doesn't mean refusing to protect the innocent. It doesn't mean abandoning justice. It means something more difficult. Refusing to become a mirror of the person who hurt you. They hate you, you hate them. They hurt you, so you hurt them. Until eventually, you can no longer tell where their hatred ends and yours begins. Jesus offers a way out, not by winning the argument, not by defeating the enemy, but by refusing to let hatred reproduce itself through you. And then he gives the reason that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. The sun rises on both, and rain falls on both. The point isn't that good and evil are identical. It's that God's goodness is not restricted to those who deserve it. And that is perhaps the most radical part of the command. Love is no longer a reward for good behavior. It becomes a choice. And this brings us back to Thorfinn. He began his life believing that another person's death could finally give meaning to his own suffering. But slowly, he begins to discover another possibility. Maybe your suffering doesn't have to produce another person's suffering. Maybe it can produce responsibility, compassion. Maybe it can produce a decision that says it ends with me. And that phrase changes everything, because now having no enemies doesn't mean nobody is against you. It means you refuse to participate in the creation of another enemy. You refuse to answer hatred with hatred. You refuse to let another person's violence decide the shape of your soul. But there's still one problem, a very serious one. Because what happens when loving your enemy seems to mean allowing them to hurt someone else? What happens when someone is actively dangerous? What happens when refusing to fight means abandoning the person who can't defend themselves? Is non-violence always moral? Or can there be moments when love itself requires resistance? Because maybe the hardest question isn't, can I love my enemy? It's, can I oppose my enemy without becoming one? There's an easy way to misunderstand everything we've said so far. You could hear, love your enemies, and think, do nothing. You could hear, do not repay evil with evil, and think, allow evil to happen. You could hear, have no enemies, and think, never stand against anyone. But that isn't what non-violence has to mean, because there's a difference between refusing to fight and refusing to resist. One of the clearest examples comes from a man who built an entire political movement around that distinction, Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi called it satyagraha, often translated as something like truth force. The idea was not simply don't hurt people. It was the belief that injustice could be resisted without reproducing the hatred and violence that created it. And that distinction matters, because if someone is opposing you, doing nothing isn't necessarily peace. Sometimes it's simply surrender. Gandhi's answer was different. Resist. Refuse cooperation. Refuse obedience. Accept suffering rather than inflict it. Stand against injustice without making the destruction of your opponent the goal. And suddenly, we arrive at a strange paradox. Non-violence can require enormous strength, because violence gives you something immediate. You can strike, you can punish, you can force, you can make another person afraid. But non-violence asks you to stand in front of power and refuse to become what you oppose. That can be even harder, because you aren't merely controlling your hands, you're controlling what happens inside of you. The desire to retaliate, humiliate, the desire to make the other person suffer simply because they made you suffer. And this brings us back to Thorfinn. For most of his life, strength meant one thing: the ability to kill. The stronger warrior wins, the weaker one dies. Power belongs to whoever can impose his will on something else. But slowly, Thorfinn begins to imagine another definition. Maybe strength isn't only the ability to hurt someone. Maybe strength is the ability to possess that power and choose what you do with it. That changes the meaning of his famous words, I have no enemies. It doesn't have to mean nobody will ever hurt me. It can mean I refuse to make hatred my response to being hurt. And that is a much more difficult philosophy, because now we have to separate three things that are often treated as one: opposition, violence, and hatred. They're not identical. You can oppose someone without hating. You can resist something without wanting revenge. And at least in principle, you can even fight someone without believing that their destruction is the purpose of your life. But this is where the philosophy becomes dangerous to oversimplify. Because imagine someone is attacking an innocent person. You have the ability to stop them. What does having no enemies require? Do you stand aside because you refuse violence, or do you intervene because refusing to act would allow someone else to suffer? Now the question changes. It's no longer, is violence good or bad? It becomes, what do you do when every available choice carries a cost? Sometimes doing nothing has consequences. Sometimes fighting has consequences. Sometimes protecting someone requires confrontation. And sometimes the person you are resisting really is doing something wrong. So perhaps the goal was never to create a world where nobody opposes you. That world may not exist. Maybe the goal is something more demanding: to resist without hatred, to protect without revenge, to pursue justice without cruelty, to stop someone without needing them to suffer. And now we can return to the question that started all of this. What would it mean to live as if you have no enemies? Maybe it doesn't mean pretending that evil doesn't exist. Maybe it doesn't mean refusing to fight under every circumstance. Maybe it means refusing to let another person's evil determine your own. Because the moment you say they hurt me, therefore I must hurt them, you have entered the same logic that created the conflict in the first place. And maybe that's the line Thorfinn spends his entire life trying to discover. Not the line between peace and violence, but the line between resistance and revenge. Because if you can simply stand against someone without hating them, then perhaps you have discovered something even more difficult than peace: freedom. Maybe we've found an answer. Don't seek revenge. Pursue justice. Resist hatred. Love your enemies. Master yourself. Break the cycle. It almost sounds perfect. Almost. Because philosophy is easy until someone gives you a reason to hate. Imagine someone hurts you, not a stranger, someone you love, mother, father, brother, child, and suddenly this isn't an abstract question anymore. You aren't standing in a classroom discussing morality. You're standing in the aftermath, and someone tells you, don't hate them. Would you? What if they hurt you again? What if they aren't sorry? What if they know exactly what they're doing? What if they continue hurting innocent people? What if the only way to stop them is to stand against them? Now the phrase, I have no enemies, begins to feel almost impossible. Because surely there are people we should oppose. There are actions we should condemn. Injustices we should resist. People who must be stopped. So perhaps the phrase cannot literally mean there's nobody in this world I should ever stand against, because that would be impossible and maybe even dangerous. Because a world in which nobody is willing to oppose evil isn't necessarily a peaceful world. It may simply be a world where evil is left unchallenged. So we return to the distinction we made earlier. Opposition is not hatred. You can say what you're doing is wrong without saying you are nothing but an evil person. You can stop someone without needing to destroy them. You can protect something without needing revenge. You can pursue justice without making hatred the source of your actions. And this is where Thorfinn's philosophy becomes much more difficult than simple pacifism. Because Thorfinn isn't trying to create a world where nobody ever conflicts. He's trying to create a world where people don't need to become enemies. That is why Vinland matters. The farm matters. The people he meets matter. The world he wants to build matters. He doesn't simply want to stop fighting. He wants to create somewhere worth living without the endless logic of you hurt us, so we hurt you, so you hurt us again, so we hurt you harder. The cycle doesn't end because someone finally wins. It ends when someone decides there will be no next step. And perhaps that is the greatest difference between Thorfinn as a child and Thorfinn as a man. The child asks, who do I need to destroy? The man asks, what can I build instead? But even here, we shouldn't make him into a saint. Because Thorfinn is not proof that his philosophy is easy. He's proof that it's difficult. He fails, struggles, he's afraid, he carries guilt. He is still capable of anger. The difference is that he no longer wants those things to determine the direction of his life. And maybe that's the part we've misunderstood about having no enemies. It isn't the claim that nobody will ever stand against me, it's the decision. I will not build my identity around standing against them. Someone can oppose you. You can oppose what they are doing. Protect yourself, protect someone else, demand justice, and still, you don't have to hate them. You don't have to seek their suffering. You don't have to make their destruction your purpose. Because maybe the opposite of having an enemy isn't having a friend. It's something much easier. Seeing a human being where you once saw an enemy. And once you can do that, the question changes one final time. It's not, how do I eliminate my enemies? It's, how do I become someone who doesn't need them? For nearly the entire story, we have been asking the wrong questions. We asked, who's the enemy? But maybe that isn't the question Thorfinn is asking. Because if an enemy is simply someone who opposes you, then I have no enemies is impossible. There will always be someone who disagrees with you, someone who stands in your way, who wants something different from what you want, who may even wish you harm. Thorfinn can't control that. None of us can. So maybe the meaning of his words isn't found in the people around him. is found in him. Someone can oppose Thorfinn, but Thorfinn doesn't have to hate them. Someone can hurt Thorfinn, but Thorfinn doesn't have to seek revenge. Someone can become an obstacle, but Thorfinn doesn't have to make their destruction his purpose. And suddenly, the contradiction begins to disappear. Having no enemies doesn't mean nobody is against me. It means I refuse to make another person's opposition into hatred of my own. The distinction is subtle, but everything depends on it, because conflict is often treated as a two-sided equation. You oppose me, therefore I oppose you. You hurt me, therefore I hurt you, and so on. And once both sides accept that logic, the relationship becomes reciprocal. The enemy is no longer simply the person who stands against you. The enemy becomes the relationship itself. I'm against you because you are against me. Thorfinn's philosophy attempts to break that symmetry. Someone can stand against him without Thorfinn needing to become their counterpart. Someone can bring hatred toward him without hatred being returned. And this is where everything we've explored begins to converge. Buddhism asks us to break the cycle of hatred. Stoicism asks us to master what belongs to us. Christianity asks us to love those who oppose us. Gandhi asks us to resist injustice without becoming consumed by hatred. And Thorfinn tries to live it. But notice what this doesn't mean. It doesn't mean everyone is good. It doesn't mean nothing is wrong. It doesn't mean never resist. And it certainly doesn't mean let people hurt you. It means that the moral status of another person's actions does not determine the moral character of your response. Someone can do wrong, and you can still choose not to become cruel. Someone can hate you, and you can still choose not to hate. Someone can commit violence, and you can still refuse to make violence the center of your identity. Maybe that is the real freedom Thorfinn discovers. Not freedom of conflict, freedom from being defined by it. Look at that boy he was. His entire existence pointed outward, toward Askeladd. Revenge, the next battle, the next opportunity to become strong enough. And then, look at that man he becomes. His attention turns outward, but towards something completely different. Not what can I destroy, but what can I create? Not who deserves to suffer, but how can suffering end with me? And maybe that's what I have no enemies ultimately means. Not that the world has stopped producing people who oppose you, but that you have stopped needing those people to become something in opposition to them. And if that's true, then we have finally arrived at the question we began with. Because if a person really wanted to live this way, what would it require them to become? We began with a question, not how do I defeat my enemies, but what would it actually mean to live as if I have no enemies? And maybe now we can finally begin to answer it. It would require strength, but not the strength to fight, the strength not to, the strength to feel anger without becoming anger, the strength to be hurt without needing someone else to hurt. It would require courage, because refusing revenge doesn't mean nothing happened. It means looking directly at what happened and choosing what happens next. It would require forgiveness, not because every wrong is insignificant, not because every person deserves trust, but because carrying hatred forever means allowing the person who hurt you to continue shaping your life. It would require humility, the humility to recognize that the person standing against you is still a human being, not an obstacle, a villain, or an enemy. And perhaps most of all, it would require love, not the easy kind, not love reserved for people who love you back, but the kind that refuses to let another person's hatred determine the limits of your own humanity. And suddenly, Thorfinn's journey looks different. He didn't become someone who was never hurt. He became someone who refused to make his hurt the source of someone else's. He didn't erase his past. He learned to live beyond it. He didn't defeat his enemy. He became someone who no longer needed one. And maybe that's the real meaning of having no enemies. Not that nobody will ever oppose you, but that you won't allow opposition to decide who you become. Because there will always be conflict. There will always be people who disagree with us, who hurt us, misunderstand us, who stand against what we believe. And we can't control that. But we can decide what their opposition produces in us. Hatred or understanding. Revenge or justice. Destruction or creation. Another enemy or another human being. And maybe that's why Thorfinn's words are so difficult. I have no enemies isn't a description of the world. It's a declaration of the person he has chosen to become. The battlefield, the blood, the boy. Young Thorfinn, for so long, his life was defined by one question. Who do I need to kill? And for years, he believed that answer was Askeladd. But eventually, the question changed. Because what happens when the enemy is gone? What happens when revenge gives you nothing? What happens when the person you thought stood between you and peace was never the thing standing between you and peace at all? Maybe the real battle was never Askeladd. Maybe it was against the part of Thorfinn that believed suffering had to create more suffering. The violence had to be answered with violence. That his life needed an enemy in order to have meaning. Slowly, he let that person die, not his enemy, himself, the boy who needed one. And maybe that's why the words, "I have no enemies," are so much heavier now. Because they aren't saying the world is peaceful. They're saying, "I choose not to make war my identity." They aren't saying, "Nobody has ever hurt me." They're saying, "What happened to me will not decide what I do to you." They aren't saying, "There is no evil." They're saying, "I will not become evil in order to oppose it." And maybe that is the art. The art of standing against something without becoming it. The art of seeking justice without becoming consumed by revenge. The art of being hurt without passing the wound on. The art of looking at another human being and refusing to reduce them to the worst thing they've ever done. We begin by asking, what would it actually mean to live as if you have no enemies? Maybe it means recognizing that you can't control whether someone becomes your opponent, but you can control whether you make them your enemy. And then we asked, if such a life is possible, what would it require us to become? Maybe it would require us to become strong enough to forgive without forgetting, strong enough to resist without hatred, strong enough to pursue justice without revenge, strong enough to suffer without creating more suffering, to look at the person standing against us and still see a person. Maybe having no enemies isn't about changing the world until nobody stands against you. Maybe it's about changing yourself until you no longer need someone to stand against. Because maybe the hardest person to defeat isn't the person standing in front of you. It's the part of yourself that wants them to suffer. And perhaps that's what it means to have no enemies.